what is going to happen to financial markets?
We need to move beyond ESG to real and tangible impacts. Global leaders talking regeneration.
We're talking unprecedented value multiples. So what is the regenerative transition, and how will it deliver greater results than the current sustainability approaches? Welcome to the Regenerative Transition. I'm here today with Dr. Joel Hooper, who's Chief Operating Officer for Jet Group and has been working in the regeneration workspace for years. So welcome, Joel.
Thank you.
So I'm really keen to hear about what you guys are doing, and I'd like to know, what is the regenerative transition and how is it different to current sustainability practices?
Well, one thing that I think everybody should be aware of is that it's not a buzzword. So if it sounds like a buzzword, people should be a bit skeptical. Regeneration is about being born anew, that's where the word comes from. And so actually one of the things that I don't like about the word regeneration is that it sounds like, with the re part of regeneration, it sounds like we're returning to something, like trying to recreate something.
Or reorganize.
From the past,
yeah.
Which is actually not what it's about. It is about respecting the past, but mainly respecting and understanding the patterns that have led to our world being as it is, developing as it is, and understanding why it's developed the way that it has, and then based on that understanding, being able to work with it more powerfully. So that's what regeneration is about. It's not about returning to something from the past, recreating a past world that is no longer here. It's about understanding how things have come to be the way they are, where they're going, and working with them so that each participant in it finds its role, can express itself, and work together to grow the amount of life that's in a structure, grow the complexity and diversity of the relationships between things, and essentially create new patterns that allow that to happen continuously.
Okay, so let's try and make that a bit more concrete. When we're talking about a regenerative transition, what are we meaning by that?
Yeah, we're meaning working to develop something, a structure like a city, for example, to develop it in such a way that it has more life for humans as well as for all other living beings within that structure than it had before you did the work, not less.
Yeah. And so how might that apply in different contexts then, like a corporation, for instance? Because we know that corporations have some of the biggest impacts when it comes to certain types of effects that contribute to the climate crisis. And, current methodologies like ESG reporting, we're seeing a lot of policy and regulation coming down that are really trying to force organizations to behave differently. If we're to step away from those types of paradigms, what are we talking about in the context of regeneration, in that context of a corporation?
Yeah, well, I think, as I mentioned about, the heart of regeneration being understanding patterns that make our structures what they are, we really have to start there with a corporation. If we're thinking about a role of a corporation in this, we have to think about, where do our current models of corporations come from? Out of which way of thinking led to the creation of corporations as they currently are. And I would say that the level of thinking was based in quite a mechanical paradigm. So corporations essentially as a kind of mechanical-like entity, some sort of like a factory, that is able to act in predictable ways to achieve predictable types of value over a predictable time frame. And obviously we see how important that is, for example, for the relationship between senior management of a corporation and investors, where to a large extent predictability of returns and value is probably the most important thing.
Yeah, so if it's not that paradigm that we've all been trained in our MBAs and studies in economics, what would a regenerative transition look like for a corporation?
Yeah, so one thing that I would say is that we have to meet corporations like where they are at the moment. So I wouldn't want to like paint too much of a sort of a single picture about what that looks like for corporations, because I think it will be somewhat, part of regeneration is that it's alive, it's diverse, there's variety, there are many different kinds of patterns. And so I think for corporations starting to think about what regeneration might mean for them, I think they have to find their own way, create their own patterns. But what will determine whether they're doing regenerative work or not is if they are seeking to understand the larger structures that they're embedded in a more holistic way, and understand the will of those of the participants in that larger structure. So you could think about it in terms of stakeholders, which is a concept that everybody's familiar with. You could think about broadening out your set of stakeholders within the structure that you're embedded in, and that structure could be a local structure, like the region that a corporation is headquartered in, or multiple regions that a corporation operates in, or it could be a virtual structure as well. So online structures. So if we get clear on what those structures are, we get clear on our relationship to them, and we get clear on who the stakeholders, the participants are in those structures, and we really understand how the work that we're doing impacts those participants. That is really the starting point for regenerative work. And then if you add in then consciously seeking to increase the richness of relationships between all of those participants in that structure, then you can start to feel confident that you're beginning to do regenerative work.
And I think you can start even at a more granular level where you're just talking about the culture of the organization itself, right, as a corporation, because when we look at the statistics and 85% of change management attempts fail in organizations, that's a huge amount of money spent every year.
Yeah, not to mention merger and acquisition integrations, the failure rates in those and all,
Yeah, incredibly high.
Yeah.
So if you're talking about the value capture that can then start to happen, or the value creation that can start to happen when you're looking at working with wholes, like a whole organization or a whole person, or and starting to kind of like move away from the siloization, because so much of our thinking is siloed and fragmented, very post-Cartesian. So we've got departments, we've got committees and subcommittees and all these groups that are kind of working in a fragmented way. So when you're looking at what you were describing as this like enriching stakeholder set, I think that can even happen internally first, right? But a lot of those efforts, they're also siloed and fragmented away from boards.
Yeah.
So the C-suite or the boards might make a decision that then the C-suite have to like follow through, and then it kind of gets mandated from the top. Almost like how we create policy at a global level.
Yeah.
And that's, from what I see, is a large part of the reason for failure.
Yeah.
So how might the process look differently when you're working to incorporate the whole, which is a basis of regenerative work, to include the board and the C-suite, and then all elements of the organization collectively?
Yeah. Well, one thing is that I think it's okay to create sort of sub-entities within an entity. So we can have teams and functions and things like that. But I think where the regenerative way of working changes that is that we spend way too much attention on the entities themselves and way too little attention on the relationships between the entities and the patterns in those relationships. So you can think about that in terms of teams or functions in an organization. I think it's not a problem that, we have teams and functions, but it is a problem if we focus on those teams and functions themselves and we miss or under focus on the relationships between them. And then also we under focus on the relationships between them and other participants, other important participants in the structure that those teams are working in. And so that's where I would say that's what I would offer up as a really interesting and fruitful starting point for corporations. It's just to start focusing more on the relationships and start to become self-aware when you're just focusing too much on the entities.
Right.
So I really like the way that Tyson Yunkaporta puts it in his book Sand Talk, where he talks about a way of working that looks at things 3 times. So the first time you look at something, you focus on the entities, the things. The second time you look at it, you try to ignore the entities, the things, and you focus just on the relationships between the things. And then the third time you look at it, you ignore the relationships and you focus on the patterns in the relationships. I think that's like a really nice way of thinking about it.
Yeah, and you've mentioned this relational elements, right? So you've mentioned the word structure a lot of times, but I know that regenerative work really works systemically. So maybe you can break it down for us. What is the difference between a structure and a system? And if we're working with systems from a regenerative perspective, how is that different to how we typically think about things in terms of structures?
Yeah. So it's sort of, the language around this is kind of confusing for folks because a lot of the times when we call something a system, what we're actually describing is a structure, something that you can actually touch and feel and see and directly observe in the world.
Like an ecosystem.
Like an ecosystem or a solar system. Or these are what I would actually describe as structures. So if you're looking at the things through your senses, or you're experiencing the things through your senses, you can be pretty sure you're working with a structure, okay? If you're focusing on the relationships between the things, you're still in the structure. This is, the relationship between you and me in this conversation, and this whole setup is the relational elements of that are still in the world of structure. The system is what underlies that structure. It's the patterns and energies and dynamics which underlie that structure and make the structure what it is. And so when we talk about looking the third time, ignoring the things and the relationships between the things and seeing the patterns in the relationships, the patterns that we're not necessarily trained to see, but you can start to see them when you work in a regenerative way, then we're really getting to the systems level. And working at that level is so powerful because that is really what is shaping everything in the world to be what it is. Mm-hmm. And if you can work at that level, then you can work with the dynamics around what's going on, mm-hmm. To shape structures in such a way that's much more powerful and can actually benefit all of the participants in that structure.
It's really interesting because, you're a doctor, background in biology and natural sciences, so you come from that world of epistemology, but from an empirical perspective, right? Mm. And that's really what we're talking about, is that we're trained to think about structures, things that we can observe, things that we can interact with. But there's this whole world but there's this whole world of richness, of patterns and systems that give rise to these structures that we're just not taught to look at.
Yeah.
And so how was that process for you, like moving from a very empirically based scientific background to then moving into regeneration and really having to start to break down our way of thinking, because it really is a mindset shift?
Yeah, it's a huge change. It's a huge change in the way of thinking. And I think we shouldn't pretend that this is going to be easy for people to move from where they currently are and how they currently think to working in this way. So, for me, the thing that was really motivating for me to start to explore this different way of thinking was really the sort of limitations that I experienced in the world of molecular and cellular biology. I experienced it to be quite frustrating just from a pure pure curiosity about how the world works, which is a reason why I got into science and why a lot of scientists get into science. My curiosity that wasn't really satisfied, and the reason for that was that in order to do experimental science, we really need controlled experimental conditions, so that we can be sure that what we're observing and measuring is a signal that that is definitely there, that it's there every time we look at that particular experimental setup in the same way. Each time the signal is always there, and so we can trust it. So that's obviously totally understandable and has led to a great increase in knowledge, especially sort of practical knowledge. But what was unsatisfying for me in that was that I knew that those somewhat artificial experimental conditions were not reflective of whole living things as they grow and develop.
At best, it's an extrapolation of some kind, or
it's an abstraction.
Yeah.
And an abstraction is sometimes useful.
Yeah.
It sometimes can allow us to see things that we would not otherwise be able to see, and trust things that we might not otherwise be able to trust. But only abstraction, to me, is a big problem. Mm-hmm. Abstraction without being able to then come back to taking that knowledge and putting it back in the context of the thing as alive, as it is alive in the world, interacting with all of the other alive things in the world, that's a problem, because we start to then use as the basis for how we act in the world our knowledge based on the abstraction, not an understanding of how living things work together as alive in the world.
Yeah, and so what you're raising is this, I think, issue or the difference between knowledge, which you can get from an abstraction or from empirical kind of ways of relating to the world, versus understanding.
Yeah. Yeah.
And regenerative work works at the level of understanding.
Yeah.
Like with some knowledge, of course, because knowledge is important too.
Yeah.
But how do those things differ, and why is it important?
Yeah. So let's take a simple example. I think many people have done, high school science. In some school systems, it's quite common to dissect a frog, to learn about the inner biology of a frog, right? So that's an approach to getting some knowledge about the frog. You can list out the muscles. You can sketch out the muscles. You can you can learn about how fluids flow through the the inside of the frog. Poor little frog. But really, to understand what a frog is, the best way to do it is to essentially live with the frog. Observe the frog in its natural habitat. See how it behaves, see how it responds to different patterns in its environment, see what happens when it's stressed and how it responds when it's stressed. So having some knowledge about the inner workings of the frog can contribute to understanding, but it doesn't give you understanding until you've really engaged with the frog on its own terms, in its world, in its living environment. And so you can take that quite simple idea of an experience that most of us can relate to somehow, and apply it to much more complex structures, like cities, where we might have millions to tens of millions of people living there, and that's just the people. And when you think about the entire ecosystem of a city, obviously we've got billions or trillions of organisms within that structure.
Mm-hmm. And so that level of complexity is what most of us are afraid of, right? Because it feels too overwhelming to be able to process all that information.
Yeah. And
I think it alludes to the dangers of these smart, like cookie cutter smart city solutions, or a lot of the big consulting firms go in with this very colonial approach to working with groups in terms of advisory and coming in and predominantly white men, no offense, but coming in and saying how things need to be done. So how does Jet Group work, or how does the regenerative transition work take place so that, you know, it doesn't follow that type of prescriptive way of being and able to deal with large quantities of complexity?
Yeah. I think every multinational company has to be aware of this colonial pattern, because if you know because a lot of our models for how businesses work and how multinational businesses work come out of colonial patterns. If we are not aware, we will just replicate those colonial patterns, and so that's really important in terms of how we think about regenerative work. So the most important thing about the way Jet is approaching regenerative work, and how I would say the best regenerative practitioners would are approaching work, is that the understanding and the work that takes place in any regenerative project has to be what we might call place sourced. So it has to arise out of the living beings that really live in that place, that really feel a sense of belonging to that place. And so that's key to the work. So when Jet partners with a city or a municipality,
Or even a corporation, you could have a sense of a place-based
or even
association for a corporation.
Yeah, or even a corporation. It's really about helping to surface deep understanding that is already there in those places, and providing a bit of infrastructure really to surface that understanding and have it turn into a quality of work that is really satisfying to those people.
And by infrastructure, you mean that figuratively, right?
Yeah, that's a
like
metaphor.
a regenerative framework infrastructure.
Yeah. It's a metaphor, because I had a bit of a metaphor around sort of like, scaffolding that, helps someone climb up to a higher place. And so really, we know if we're doing regenerative work because we can see the people who belong in a place really shining in a way that is all about them realizing their own potential, them seeing new opportunity for themselves, their own wills being activated. And that's a beautiful thing to experience.
And because if you have that level of stewardship and co-creation, then it regenerates itself over time, right? It doesn't need this constant external facilitation, which I think is key to a lot of the value drivers that come out of this work. So tell me a bit more. Jet Group is one of the only companies that has brought together regenerative work with technology and innovation.
Yeah.
So how has that process been for you, working with engineers and folks who are very, very used to like ones and zeros type thinking, shifting that whole mindset into a regenerative approach so that the technology itself is built on regenerative frameworks, can support the regenerative transition of those stakeholders? Yeah.
Well, one thing I would say is that because there is a bit of momentum around regeneration, and because organizations are clearly going to look to try to tap into that for their own benefit, there's going to be a lot of talk about regenerative software. There is, you can guarantee it. In 3 years from now, it's going to be all over the place, right? But most of it won't be regenerative. And the idea of software enabling regenerative work is going to be much, much harder and more nuanced than what most people are going to be willing to recognize. And the reason for that is, if we go back to the understanding why things are the way that they are, the reason for that is because technology is sourced in a mechanistic paradigm, a mechanistic way of thinking, right? It's about
inputs and outputs.
Inputs and outputs. It's about linear dynamics. It's about rules-based. It's about breaking things down into their parts to make it manageable. So that's not easy to merge that, or you can't merge it, but that's not easy to sort of square that paradigm with a regenerative paradigm.
Yeah.
That's a really hard thing to do, and that's what we're really thinking deeply about at Jet.
Yeah.
Is what that even means. What does it even mean for software to truly enable regenerative work? And I think one of my first experiences with a particular team that I'm working with, within Jet at the moment, is that it's really going to lead to new design patterns being invented for how we think about software. And that's really exciting because I think software is our use of technology, like software-based technologies, is actually really in its infancy. If you think about the full lifespan of Homo sapiens, and you look at how much of that lifespan is, or how little of that lifespan, software has existed.
Yeah.
It's in its infancy.
Right.
And so I think like everything is there to be invented and created.
And governance is such a huge topic, right? We're seeing it, so much of it driven from policy, regulation. It's a huge focus area for corporations and cities alike, particularly around, how are we meeting certain expectations to mitigate the climate crisis? So many countries have come out with their 2030 strategy. And I've heard you guys have come out with a community app, which is about dynamic governance, right? When I was first introduced to the new concept of dynamic governance that was created by the World Economic Forum and Boston Consulting Group, I looked at it and I'm like, well, this is not really dynamic, because the only thing that changed really was temporality, where they start, organizations start looking at future risk, because that came with the onset of COVID, right? The pandemic, this future risk.
Yeah.
And we know that with climate change, we're going to see a lot more of those types of risks.
Yeah.
But there wasn't this interesting interplay, dynamic interactions with, risk, opportunity, and impact. Because there are things as a corporation that I will do that then have certain impacts in the world that then create certain conditions that then we have to mitigate ourselves from the risk of. And so this kind of like integrated way of looking at risk, but done from the perspective of community, which is extraordinary, because it's like really about community self-organizing principles and how is each place unique and how can it become its steward over its own governance system that is regenerating value.
Yeah.
What do you think is important about something like that? Because I've never heard of anything else that does that.
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting things in this is that, and I think we all have to think about this, is if we are static in our way of thinking or our process or our way of working, if we are static, what is that going to mean for doing work in a world that is fundamentally dynamic, right? So all life is essentially dynamic. Constant change, constant development. Every new experience that we have leaves its mark on us, changes us in some way, influences our behavior. And so that to me really gets to the heart of a lot of our social and environmental crises, is we're seeking to develop steady states. Static is attractive because it's repeatable. It's we'll feel confident with it, working with it. But when we bring static ways of thinking and static processes and systems and governance models to do work in a dynamic system, essentially we're holding that system back. We're holding the structures back from their natural state, which is to grow and evolve and realize new potential, create new patterns. And so you're right to point out, I agree with you in pointing out that model that was created is not really dynamic, not in the sense that we're talking about at Jet, because dynamic to us means that the governance really supports and enables change and new patterns and everybody developing themselves.
And by the sounds of it, human development as well.
Human
right?
development as well.
Yeah. And so that's really interesting what you're saying, because with these linear frames of governance or even economics, it's largely transactional. It's a linear transaction, and that's how we assess value. A lot of the time, it's like, I'm going to invest in X and I expect to get Y out. So when we're talking about value creation, because this is something a lot of corporations and cities are really scared about doing things differently, right? For fear of losing value.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about value creation, what is a regenerative way of delivering value look compared to the traditional transactional model? Because this is really where we're needing to shift to in order to create value multiples.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think we need to start, like the starting point for that is actually prioritizing value creation over the level of predictability in the value creation. That's a big difference.
Yeah.
So we often...
You just said everybody's risk bells off, sounding alarms right now.
Yeah, well, because we often talk about value creation as the most important thing, but I don't think it is, in the current way of working with it. As I said earlier, I think...
It's protecting itself from loss.
Yeah, it's about predictability.
Yeah.
And essentially control.
Yeah.
And so that is the heart of this shift in, so I would say that what people are saying they're doing right now, which is, value creation is the most important thing. In order to do that, you need to work regeneratively. And that's where, when you unlock the living potential of a structure like a city, with all of its human inhabitants, but as well all of the rest of the ecosystem within a city, that's where initially there will be fear, because the level of predictability might feel lower, at least until we practice and work with it, and get more confident. But the potential for unlocking value creation
is enormous.
Is like, it's an exponent. Like, some tech companies talk about exponential. That ain't exponential.
Yeah.
This is exponential.
Yeah. Yeah, and it sounds like, this is a reason why so many M&As fail to capture their synergies, right? They do this assessment of synergies, and even those assessed based on a very linear way of transacting value. But if they're not working regeneratively, then you're actually going to try and bring two systems or two structures together that end up becoming degenerating over time, because you're not working from this regenerative frame.
Yeah, and it's back to sort of like the Colonial Model again. Like, when you bring two companies together, one of them is dominant, right? One of them has more power, and one of them, and the smaller one, or the non-dominant one, is coming in essentially into a fear-based system, where they know that the dominant one can kick out the management team, can fire a bunch of people. And so you see, when you've worked closely with M&As, like I have, and a bunch of other people have, you see sometimes a dramatic and sudden shift, but sometimes a very much slower shift, depending on the approach that the senior management team of the dominant company wants to take in any particular situation. Shift from the culture of the non-dominant company towards the culture of the dominant company.
Yeah.
And that is just, nothing new is being created out of that. That's why you can't think of that approach is in any way regenerative, because no new pattern is being created.
Right.
The regenerative way of thinking about a merger would be understand deeply the patterns in both structures, and then seek a way to create something which is genuinely new, which genuinely respects and reconciles the patterns of each individual pattern of the two other companies, and uses that to create new potential for both groups of people, as well as all of their
Unlocking
stakeholders.
A whole new value creation.
A whole new source of value creation.
Yeah. Well, I think we're out of time. So I hear you're about to go and start doing some big stuff with cities in the Middle East. So I look forward to having you back on the show later in the year.
Thanks so much.
I can't wait to hear how some of that incredible work has happened, and some of the challenges and what's opened up in the learning around this particular region's work on citywide transitions.
Yeah, this has been a really fun conversation. Love to be back.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming. And we'll see you at the end of next month for the next episode of The Regenerative Transition.